Welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about my life through books. So I am turning 29 on February 18, and so this is my last year of the 20s, and it's my birthday in general, so I thought I would do a video of books kind of related to that. So I have 29 books for the 29 years of my life. They don't all correlate with the year specifically. Some of these are recommendations and some of them are firmly not. They were either very important to me or they represent something in my life. This was a lot of fun to put together, so I'll go ahead and get started. So I will start with The Beginning. Some of the first books that I remember liking or asking for were going to be Dr. Seuss. One of the ones that I remember really well is the Feet book, which is cute. I, for some reason, have a really vivid memory of that in my granddad's house. I honestly could not tell you what all is in the Feet book currently because I haven't seen it in a really long time. But a reason why that might also be, like, in my head associated with his house, too, is because when we would run around without, like, socks or shoes on, like, that would be Happy Feet. So, the Feet book, Happy Feet, Happy Times. The other Dr. Seuss book that's significant is The Sneetches. Now, with this, like, one of the reasons why I had two books on here is because I really watched the little cartoon of it more often than actually reading the book. And I really loved that, or I remember watching it a whole lot, so. First book, Dr. Seuss. Classic. And then from there we can get into some stuff more in elementary school. Black Beauty was something that I remember being super into, as well as The Call of the Wild. From a really young age, I was obsessed with animals, so it tracks that these would be some of the books that I was super into. I have very vivid memories trying to read this and very vivid memories of watching the movie, which was maybe kind of traumatizing because one of the, like, friend horses dies and it's a sad time and whatever, but I really liked this. Call of the Wild, I also have really vivid memories reading. I think a bit later, though. It's hard. Memory's hard. Remembering things is hard. But I was super obsessed with dogs initially, like a ridiculous amount. So this is about kind of like sled dogs. This also tracks with the fact that I was obsessed with Balto. I had a Jenna doll. It was a good time. And then I also had a fair stint when I was obsessed with horses. I didn't get to the same point as dogs because with dogs I was like, the internet time that I got, I was trying to memorize stuff on AKC's website to differentiate between breeds. Like, I did have a really long period of time where I really wanted to draw a horse the right way, though. And I ended up going to camp where I could ride horses. Girl Scout camp, which I had been going to previously, but I was really wanting that one. So, anyways, little baby me really liked animals, so some of the first books that I remember really, really loving were associated with that. The next book that I have is one of the first school books that I have, like, really vivid memories of. And that's going to be Maniac Magee by Jerry Spinelli. And this is actually my copy from, like, the 4th grade. And I don't think that I really gave synopses for the other ones, but, like, everybody knows, I feel like everybody knows these. Maniac Magee is the story of a boy who doesn't really have a family, and he just kind of spends his life running. And he ends up making friends with people on both sides of the segregated city, and he's, like, the only boy, or the only person who really goes on both sides. I haven't read it in, like, a very long time, so I have a hard time saying specifics about it, but this is one of the ones that I remember really engaging in. Like, I remember pieces of, like, the class where we were, like, reading it out loud and stuff. Then next I have the book from the first series that I really got into. And that is The Guardians of Ga'Hoole. This fits in with the theme of animals. I also ended up becoming obsessed with owls and trying to draw them. The main character in this is a barn owl, so they have very interesting faces to try to draw. They're very angular. Not that y'all are asking about how to draw an owl, but yeah, this was a really good time. I don't know if I ever actually finished reading the series. I started this in probably 5th grade, maybe 4th. The main character, Soren, falls out of his nest and gets taken up by these kind of like bad guy owls and put into this institution, and like kind of teams up with some other owls and tries to figure out what's actually happening. Like, it's an orphanage, but like some really weird stuff is going on, and then that turns into this whole adventure. I would like to reread this at some point. The reason that it's so significant that this is the first series that I got into, not only was I, that's just a big thing to get into, it's reading more than one book, but there are multiple series that had huge impacts on my life. Which brings me to my next one. I don't really want to talk about or recommend, like, the main book that I really got into, because the author has shown her whole ass, to say the least. But I couldn't make a video about this without mentioning it, and then talking not just about the book, but about the fandom, because it's the Harry Potter books. I feel like it's obvious. But it was, I got super, super into the Guardians of Ga'Hoole, but Harry Potter was like the next level. I read it. A lot of the face value themes, the things that you get if you don't actually, if you're a literal child reading it, of like love and whatever, that was really like impactful for me. But more than that, this was the first fandom that I got into, and fandom has had such a profound impact on who I am as a person. Like being able to engage in something with that depth, because I was clearly already kind of obsessed. I had, I wasn't in the Black Beauty fandom. That wasn't a thing, or it might have been a thing, but it certainly wasn't a thing that my 8-year-old self could access. But like, I was so entrenched in like animals and stuff like that. So going the next step and being able to really actively engage with something like that was incredible. I like lived on MuggleNet, loved the little like lists and everything that they pulled out. One of my best friends in middle school introduced me to fan fiction, and her fan fiction was the first stuff that I read, and from there I was able to really get engaged with it. I wrote so much. I have like I don't know if it exists anymore, but I had like this huge folder of stuff that I wrote. So it really got me engaged in a lot of that. And then that would also have impacts on like my online, like where I'm at later. That's why BookTube is so compelling, because this is like the book fandom. It's more vague, but it's easier to find things that people are like into. And the thing with the Harry Potter series fandom, it was one that I was long-term into. Like, it was like 75% of my personality in like 7th grade. Like, it was a lot. So it's really hard to talk about my reading trajectory, my life trajectory, without mentioning that. And, there's a lot more that I could talk to about the impact of fandom, especially looking like later in life too, because like a lot of the fandom stuff that I interacted with was on fandom specific websites, and it was more like I was reading fan fiction. I was kind of writing it. I only published a little bit of it online, thank God, honestly. And interacting with some people IRL. But wouldn't be until like 2012 when I was in college that there was Tumblr, and the like floodgates of fandom like opened. I got to see so much more and really interact with the people, and the things that I had been doing before, like in 7th grade when I had a binder with like bios and literal essays about what I thought was going to happen in the next book. I saw people really interacting, really dissecting what was in these books and what could be in these books. We can also talk about the fandom to LGBT information pipeline that was very significant. So fandom as a whole was very significant, and even though this isn't like a book rack or whatever, it represents a significant point in my life that is also directly related to books and reading and how I got here. Anyways, so that was a significant chunk of middle school, but also like a big piece of my life, generally speaking. The next actual book that I have, we have The Little Prince. I read this in 7th grade. This is a kid's book, originally written in French, about this little boy who lives by himself on this really small planet and goes on this kind of adventure to other planets. And this is another one that has like really sad themes, I feel like, but I really loved this. This was 7th grade was a good time for assigned readings. I have a lot of like vivid memories from that English class, and this was one of them. This is actually the newer edition that I've recently bought that has a lot more. The story itself is not this long. It's very small if you get the paperback. But I can definitely see like my love for reading and understanding of a lot really develop like around this book, especially because there is a lot symbolically that you can pick out. And I mean, that's when we were learning about symbols, metaphors, whatever. And this really heavily impacted me. And this is definitely one that I would still recommend. And in that same vein, The Giver was a big one from that same class. Again, we were kind of looking deeper into it. The element of it being a dystopia was really interesting, and the fact that it engaged with kind of some more intense themes. I had a really good time reading it, and it's one that, like, outside of class, I tried to read some of the other books in the series, too, because it impacted me that much. So both The Giver and The Little Prince were really big, I think, markers of like me going further in reading so far as like reading analysis, but also just another really vivid period of time that I remember finding new books that I really loved. Then moving right along, we're going to wildly go in the other direction and bring up a Stephen King book. This is Insomnia. This is probably my dad's copy of Insomnia that I read in 8th grade and then proceeded to not give back because I'm a horrible person. But describing this is a little bit difficult because I haven't read it since 8th grade. But the main thing is that the main character starts seeing these little men, and whenever he sees these little men go in somewhere, they come out and someone has died. He also at the same time starts seeing like auras and like little like lifelines above people's heads, and he figures out that these little men are death, and he kind of goes through the process of figuring out like if they're good or bad, and ends up teaming up with a couple of them that are the ones in charge of like natural death, and this whole plot happens with the kind of bad deaths or unnatural deaths, and he has to stop something from happening. I remember really liking this. This was one of the first adult books that I read, but definitely the first one that I really remember. So this just had a really big impact on me as a middle schooler. I've made the executive decision for the fandom piece to not count as a book slot because I thought of another book that I needed to bring up that I just didn't think about before. So, I have The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. And this, I think, in part could be connected to The Giver, like, in, like, the themes of what I was reading, right? This, I don't think that I read until my sophomore year of school. It came out, or this paperback, at least, came out in 2008. So sophomore makes sense. I really loved this. I read and reread this series. Was disappointed by the last book, but what else is new? That tends to happen with series. And again, this is just something that I was able to like dig into more thematically. I also had like lots of thoughts and opinions because like the movie came out, and I only actually watched the first movie. The first movie wasn't bad, but the way that this one and the rest of them were marketed pissed me off so much that I did not watch the rest of the movies, because the whole point is like looking at how the Capitol views this like horrendous game going on that's supposed to suppress people, and the way that they frame stuff is very superficial. So instead of the commercials for the movies focusing on Katniss and her plight and like the issue of, I wouldn't have called it class inequality, but that's what it was. They were like Team Peter or Team Gale, and I was like, y'all, she didn't want either of those motherfuckers. What are you doing? Like, this is literally what the Capitol turned the Hunger Games into. So I got really upsetty. Did not watch the other movies, but I really, really loved the books. So this would have been really important, and like a little, like, I don't think that I ever got into Hunger Games fan fiction, mostly because I didn't think about it, because all the sites that I'd been using were like fandom specific. But that was a really big deal for me. And then this next one is another series, but it's bad. The Hunger Games, I think, would probably stand up. This next series would not stand up. It was the early 2000s. Like, we could talk about Twilight, but Twilight is another one where it's trash, and I simply don't want to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about another trashy romance, or not, well, yeah, romance-y. Another trash young adult YA series that I would not recommend. However, there are specific things that I want to talk about with it. This is the first book of the House of Night series, which was, you know, one of the many vampire series, kind of academic related. There's like a vampire school. She's like the chosen one to deal with all of this kind of stuff. I don't even remember that much at this point, and I didn't finish the series because I think I think it's done at this point, but the like last books came out relatively recently. I don't know, but I do know I read this in like 2009. And objectively speaking, like, the way that it's written is kind of insufferable. It's very, like, the way that they write teen girls talking is, like, bad. However, I thought that it was a fun time as a high schooler with half a brain cell. And this book I specifically wanted to talk about, because this was the first book that I read with a gay character in it, with an obviously gay character. Of course, at this point, I think I'd read The Great Gatsby, The Awakening. There's also something to be said about Romeo and some of his friends and Romeo and Juliet. But, so, you could argue that I read queer books, or books with queer things in it before them, but they certainly weren't discussed, or in my very clueless brain. But this was the first book that I read with a gay character in it. He is a very stereotypical gay BFF. But it was the first queer character, which is significant. From there, we can move on to some single books that I read that were really impactful for me in different ways. The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. This is about a couple of boys who grew up in Afghanistan in, I think, the 70s and 80s. And it talks about the kind of racial, religious kind of issues within that. The two boys are a part of, I think, two different sects of Islam, but there are also two different like races within this, so that those are both, I think, tied in. Something happens in the book to his friend. I don't want to give it away. It is like triggering. Check out the trigger warnings for this book if you do read it. I think that it probably would stand out, but I haven't read it since I was in like junior in high school. But something happens to this boy, and the main character doesn't do anything about it. And the rest of the book, it talks about their lives, and in a lot of ways, he's contending with that inaction. So this book made a huge impression for me. This I read for a class, but it was one of the ones where we could like choose a book to do a report on. That kind of like lesson, like the fact that people's decisions can impact so much. One person's decision can impact so much about so many different people, was really intense and important to me at the time. And then from there, we have another depressing read that highly impacted me. That is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I didn't actually know that this was young adult until I worked at a bookstore and saw that it was shelved in young adult. I just thought this was regular historical fiction. It is from the perspective of a little girl who lives in Nazi-occupied Germany. This is actually told from the perspective of death, and so you're seeing what all's going on with her. Her family harbors a Jewish person in the middle of all of this. And it is incredible. This was actually a recommendation from one of my managers at my first job who was like obsessed with it. Rightfully so. It's a good book. And there was just so much of this that was incredible to me. Like the narration like blew my mind. I'd never read anything like that before. Like it's narrated by death. Like I feel like at this point more people have seen like stuff like that happen, so it's not as like mind-blowing, but for me at the time that was cool as fuck. And I mean, there were a lot of topics that they hit on, again, like really deep thematic stuff that just really heavily impacted me. So this was a big read for me. And I think that between, you know, that bit in 7th grade, and then with things around like The Book Thief, and even The Kite Runner, and maybe some other stuff, I think that definitely influenced my decision to become, to want to become an English teacher, which I guess I technically did, but in like a roundabout way. I initially wanted to be like a vet, like up until my sophomore year of high school. And I took chemistry and it went poorly. So then I kind of shifted gears and I was like, I guess I'll be a teacher. I was thinking English or music. Then I took music theory and I was like, no, I'm like trash at this. So it was English. And these kinds of books, like again, being able to really dig into stuff on like a deeper like thematic level and like that sort of thing. These were really kind of influential in that. The next two books that I'm going to talk about, I also read in high school, but also in college. And I think that they're definitely like bridges between those two times. And I'll just get into it. So, Hamlet by William Shakespeare. I read this for AP English, and I mean, I marked it up. I didn't usually do this. Like, this was when they were, like, teaching us to do this sort of thing. But, like, I read this 5 times when we were reading it for class because I read it really quickly and I was, like, obsessed. Like, the whole... Like, again, it's stuff that's not, like, mind-blowingly intense to, I think a lot of people, especially if you're used to reading and whatever, but, like... The fact that you don't know if Hamlet is reliable and like, is he crazy? Is he trying to throw people off? Like, what is happening? It was just really cool to me. And I also hadn't, like, we'd read Shakespeare, a couple of different Shakespeare stuff actually. So this wasn't I think that I was a little bit more used to it. I was fucking obsessed with this. And when I went into college, I took the Shakespeare class and was also very into it. Unfortunately, I had to drop it the first semester because things got too much. Clearly dropped the wrong class, though. But when I took it again, it was incredible. And, like, learning about Shakespeare's background just made this cooler. So that was a really influential one for me. The other book that I read both in high school and college is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And my perspective of this book totally changed from high school to college. And so when I initially read this, I read this for the same class as I did Hamlet. It was for my AP English my senior year. And I was really frustrated with this book because of how it was written. Which, like I said, like with Shakespeare, I was kind of used to it and knew about like the language changing a little bit. With Their Eyes Were Watching God, it's written in like the way that people would have talked. This is set in the... can't remember what year exactly it was set in, but like the early 1900s within Southern Black community. And she very intentionally writes in the way that they would have spoken. So when I initially read this, I couldn't get past the way that it was written to actually dig into the story. Now, I read this in college, probably my junior year. Things are fuzzier than they ought to be, and was able to appreciate it a lot more. We talked more about why it was written that way and the significance of it. I read this as a part of a Black women's literature class. So we were having a lot of like other extensive conversations. The whole class was actually framed around this book. This was the first book that we read, and then we used it as a frame of reference for talking about other books that were written at different times. So I have a way deeper appreciation for the book. Not just in that I was able to actually engage with the story more, but also like I like it also because she made this decision. So I think that represented a lot of growth for me in terms of really understanding things like that, which ended up being extremely significant, particularly because I ended up focusing on language as a big part of my studies. My graduate thesis was on language usage, and while it's not the same as like looking at speech patterns, it's still related. And I think that kind of opened my mind more to more of a descriptivist attitude towards language rather than prescriptivist, which high school me was very into because I had half a brain cell. And also tend to over-apply certain rules. So learning in the grammar class that I think I took before this class, we learned about prescriptivist versus descriptivist, and it went on from there, especially as I learned more social science stuff. So that was a significant book. And that brings us into college. So the first, actually, a lot of the books that I have at this for my undergrad weren't actually books that I read, despite the fact that I had, like, I got an English degree. So there are a lot of books that I did read for class, but a lot of the ones outside of class had certain significance. So the next one that I have is Tweak by Nick Sheff. This is a memoir about his experience being addicted to meth and heroin. And I read this book several times. I don't have tabs in it, but I do have sticky notes inside the book. A lot of them. I read this several times. I also read his dad's book, Beautiful Boy, a couple of times. And I think I only read the follow-up to this once, and it was a while after. But I got obsessed with this. Seeing... I read this my freshman year of college. So this is, like, I guess just really opened me up to other people's perspectives and experiences. I hadn't really read any nonfiction other than like textbooks before this. And I just got really invested, like, in how he wrote and how, like, scary of an experience it is. One of the last scenes or things within this book, when he relapses, there's this really vivid scene of him, like, thinking that he's a bug and trying to climb a wall that maybe slightly traumatized me a little bit, and definitely made it to where I am would not touch hard drugs. But this was just a really intense read for me, and one that I got like hyper focused on, and an issue that I ended up caring an awful lot about. And it's significant to mention too, because like I had this in mind while taking my psychology classes. I got a minor in psychology before going on to I got a master's in sociology, so like kind of keeping with the interest in the social sciences, and seeing somebody's, I think, actual struggle with addiction kind of helped put things into perspective, especially because, like, something to frame all of this in, like, I'm still currently in Tennessee. I grew up in Tennessee. The political beliefs of the people around me, I mean, there was definitely some diversity, I guess, because my certain parts of my family were not like super conservative, but some of them were, and a lot of like the people in general, like it was way more like being a Democrat and voting like strictly Democrat was like a lot. So the political range that I saw was right to American center, which we know is not actually center. So this, I guess, knocked away some of the ideas of like hyper individualism, or like the idea that people in this kind of state like brought it upon themselves or something like that. It showed that it was a lot more complicated. So that was significant. And then from there I could talk about some of the YA that I read in college. One of the things that I kind of like hyper focused on, well, I guess two of them. This book represents two of the things that I like hyper focused on. So one of the things was book banning. I at some point was very determined to read as like the whole ALA's top 100 list of banned books. And I initially picked up this book in part because I saw that it was banned. The other reason that I picked it up was because I got super obsessed with the author even before then. I still watch the vlog Brothers I Am a Nerd Fighter, but 2011 is when I found them. And they've been on the internet doing things since 2007. Their first year, they put out a video every single day. And in 2011, I caught up. I watched all of them. And so I'd already been, like, interested in, like, banned books and stuff like that. And I saw the video of John talking about how Looking for Alaska was banned in a county in Tennessee. So I was like, okay, I adore John and Hank. I need to read John's books, and I'm gonna start with this one because it was banned, and since this is his first one, I also like worked up like chronologically. I think I read this around the time Tifios came out, maybe. I don't know. Time is really hard to decipher, generally speaking, but also when you're mentally unwell. So, but we have Looking for Alaska, which this is one that I'm not sure if I would recommend. I think that some people will get a lot out of it, and some people will think that it's cheesy or pretentious. I read this originally in like 2011, 2012, and I fucking loved it. I did reread it, which I'll talk about the reread because we can also talk about that bridge, kind of like we did with Hamlet and Their eyes were watching God. So, this I initially read around then, and it was another one where, like, there were elements in here that are not novel to me anymore. So, like, I know that other people have done it in different ways, but this was the stuff that he was trying to say in here really was incredible to me. This focuses on a boy who moves from Florida to Alabama to go to this boarding school that his dad had gone to. He's obsessed with people's last words, and he's really trying to find his place. He's moving out of state to seek a great perhaps. So, you know, coming of age, whatever. The way that the book is set up, at the beginning of each little section, it has like a number of, you know, like 200 days before, 5 days before. So it's counting down to something and you don't know what. And I won't say what on the off chance that somebody wants to read this or hasn't read it. But a really big theme in this is looking at people in a more complex way, or acknowledging that you're not going to understand the person fully, but also warning against imagining people in a way that only serves you. One of the things that really pissed me off about the John Green hate Tumblr era was people completely misreading this, because a lot of people were like, oh, well, he wrote this like manic pixie dream girl. He wrote this to talk about why the manic pixie dream girl trope is bad. Like, you have to go in either with no critical analysis or intentionally missing the point in order to not get this, which is why he wrote, or well, it's not why he wrote Paper Towns, but I think that people misunderstanding that is why Paper Towns verged more on preachy, which, like, it's a fine book. It's not my favorite. But the fact that he did that, these themes of imagining people complexly, like, was really compelling to me, and especially being able to hear John talk about it outside of that, because, like, one of the big things that they talk about from time to time, one of the quotes that comes to my head is the truth resists simplicity. And that's, I don't know how to put into words, like, how and why exactly that, like, means so much. But in learning, just in general, I think the thing that compels me to literature is the same thing that compels me to social science. And it is deeply wanting to understand people. And this interacted with that in a way that was just so profound to me. That's Looking for Alaska and my experience with Looking for Alaska. The next book that I have is also a John Green book. That is Will Grayson, Will Grayson. He wrote this with David Levithan. So I already talked about the bad, I was going to say questionable book, bad series. The House of Night, with the first gay character that I ever read. The first book that I had with a gay main character written by a gay man was Will Grayson, Will Grayson. For those who don't know, this is a story about two boys named Will Grayson who happened to meet each other. It's looking at their individual lives when they meet, and just like kind of what their lives look like. John writes one of the Will Graysons, and David Levithan writes the other Will Grayson. The Will Grayson that David Levithan writes is the gay one. That was very important and compelling to me. The book itself, I thought, was good. I have not read it recently, so I can't vouch for it officially. But I really liked the book. This was, and another thing with John, he also completely influenced my music tastes. The Mountain Goats has been my most played band every year that I've had Spotify, except for the last two. 2020, it was Laura Jane Grace, and Against Me, like, edged them out by just a little bit. And then this past year, I just screwed myself over by listening to stuff, like, while I was reading, like, the last 2 months of the year. But they would have been my top band if they hadn't had that. So, Mountain Goats I knew about through John Green. With Will Grayson, the band that though John's Will Grayson was going to see was Neutral Milk Hotel. And I thought that was just a made-up band because that's a wacky kind of name. But I found them, and no, they're one of my favorite bands. So, this kind of goes to show just, the media that I consume consumes me. But that's fine. Regardless, Will Grayson, first gay character that I had read, written by a gay man. And for a long time, David Levithan was the only, like, gay author that I knew about. Could I have Googled lists of books with gay authors? Maybe. There is not the same wealth of information now that there is now that there was then. Tumblr also existed, but like I didn't really see people recommending stuff. It was mostly people talking about lack of representation and people writing their own representation via fan fiction, which is like, absolutely love that. But I was also, I think, scared to really look too much into it. So every time I would go into a bookstore, I would look and see if they had David Levithan books, and then I would look in their LGBT section. But their LGBT section was a lot of the times crap, first of all, and was social science books and yaoi. Like, that was, that's what the LGBT book sections looked like. So, I did read more David Levithan, and that brings me to the next book, which is The Realm of Possibilities, which, impacted me on a number of levels because this has gay characters in it. It's actually bookended. This is a series of poems that are all told, the same instance told from different perspectives, all from different people in the same school. And it's bookended by two boys that are together. So this was really cool for like the multiple perspective thing, the fact that it was a poetry collection, and I'd, like, read poetry. We've had to read poetry for school. I had an Edgar Allan Poe phase at a certain point, although I was more interested in his short stories than his poetry. But, you know, this was one of the few times that I engaged with poetry, like, by myself, like, for my own reasons, and I ended up really loving this. This next book that I need to talk about, I actually didn't originally have in the stack, so this is probably going to end up being like 30 books. It's fine. It's whatever. There are no rules here. I just realized that I didn't include this on the list, but it was an essential read for me, and that was The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. Not to be the most, unoriginal YA reader. We've got John Green and Perks of Being a Wallflower, but they really were very impactful. I read this so many times around 2013, which would have been around the time when I was in my John Green era. I was rereading Fault in Our Stars a lot, and I was reading this one a lot. And the way that it's written, I really like it. It's written in epistolary format. It's kind of the coming of age, figuring out friends. And I related to this book a lot. I think there were a lot of things about Charlie's character that were, like, very relatable to me. The mental health stuff that he's dealing with. And also I think the loneliness to a certain extent, which is not something that I, like, wanted to think about. I had friends, but things were complicated. And I mean, I'm not going to go into it too much, but I definitely think that I could relate to some of it and still relate to some of it. I'm overdue for a reread. But there were a lot of things in this that were deeply relatable. And this was the first time that I'd felt any kind of seen in a fairly big way in any of the stuff that I read. That's not to say that I didn't, like, relate to any of the characters, but I felt, like, a piece of my experience was seen. Not that I did, go through or, like, do all of the things that he did, because our high school experiences weren't the same. But certain things about the character made me feel very seen. And then that brings us to talking about other gay shit. So we had David Levithan, we had Fandom stuff online. So somebody that I ended up finding really early on, or not really early on, this would have been like my junior year of college. Maybe sophomore, probably junior. We've discussed how time isn't really a thing that works very well. But Ash Hardell was really huge for me. Now, this book did not get published until 2016. But I found Ash's stuff in probably 2013 or 2014, and I watched their stuff so much. I loved that, like, they were talking about LGBT issues. The timeline is unclear, but I think that I found them right after I came out. So I saw them kind of looking into all of these different identities. They would have different people talk about their experiences with them. And again, just like seeing the multiple ways that people could experience things was fascinating, and seeing the different ways that folks conceptualize themselves was really cool. And I just like fell in love with their content and with like them as a person. They seemed like really, really cool. There's a lot that I could go into with them as a person. I know that that's not like the book or whatever, but that's a lot of what this book represents. It's not just it by itself, which by itself it is a good book. They published this in 2016. This is the ABCs of LGBT. It looks at different identities. The first part talks about like how people conceptualize their identities insofar as like what it is for identity to be on, well, there's an introduction, and then like what is it for your identity to be on a spectrum? What can that look like? What are some different ways that we can conceptualize it? And then they talk a lot about different sexuality terms, different gender terms. And so they have definitions, they have some discussion about identities and stuff like that. And throughout this whole thing, they also have different people who identify these certain ways talking about their experience. So it's a very cool book. There's definitely been more that's happened since 2016, but it is more up to date than a lot of like other stuff. And I think that a lot of the really important stuff definitely still stands. The spectrum part and people's experiences of identifying in those different ways, I think is still really important. It's also worth noting that this, like, as much as like Ash wrote this book, Ash compiled this, Ash did just a fuckload of work. This is his book. But one of the really cool things about it is that it's like a community project. They reached out to so many different people. And like seeing it come together, because I knew about this when it was just starting as like a series that she was putting together. So like, I don't know, it's really cool. And that sort of like activism that they were doing, putting all of that together, was just so cool to me. And at the time, I was also getting really involved in my campus LGBT group, and I was the head of the education committee, so like I was making that stuff too, and definitely their videos and all of that informed what we were able to put out as well. So it was a really great time. I feel like there's a lot more that I could say about them as a person, like inspiring me in different ways and also making me think about things in regards to my own sexuality and gender, but like I won't go into all that just because we've already kind of gone off the rails with several of these books. But yeah, the ABCs of LGBT is a good time. And related to that, I also have Making History by Eric Marcus. The updated editions of this is Making Gay History, and there's also a podcast called Making Gay History that is all of the recordings of this. This is an oral history of the LGBT community from 1945 to 1990. And I read this my senior year, alongside a lot of other stuff that really impacted the direction that I would go in with grad school and stuff like that. This was, I think, probably the first gay history book that I read. And getting to see it, again, from so many different people's perspectives and, like, understanding what they actually went through was really intense and really added to the feeling that I already had that I really wanted to help with that. I wanted to help the LGBT community. That was my big focus. Between this and there's an article that I read when I was taking intro to social work, before I graduated. This would have been in my undergrad. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was considering changing my major, whatever. I took intro to social work and read this article about trans women and risk of HIV and AIDS. And seeing, like, the way that they were treated and the way that they, like, the things that they would do that would, like, put themselves in danger largely because of their, like, marginalization. Like, they didn't really have much of a choice in it. Between that, also watching, like, Rent for the first time at the same time, which, like, tied all of this together too. Not that Rent is perfect representation by far, but all of that put together really, I think, formed the direction that I would go in so far as, like, sociology and stuff like that is concerned, which is what I got my master's degree in. So this is a great book. I would definitely recommend it. And if you can't get to the book, absolutely listen to the podcast. There's so much important stuff in here, and I feel like I talk about this all the time, but, like, history is so incredibly important for understanding what's happening right now. Like, you can read any number of, like, you know, internet posts and whatever, and talking about, like, current discourse. You need the history in order to contextualize it all. And that's something that I'm still learning and understanding more as I'm reading different perspectives and understanding longer history links too, especially looking at, like, colonization and whatever. But so this book, definitely recommend, definitely made a huge impact. And we're staying on a similar topic with the next book too. So this is The Quilt, Stories from the Names Project. I originally found this book in San Francisco. I went to San Francisco with my girlfriend at the time in 2017. And this was at an LGBT center's, like, library, which we don't have an LGBT center. I was in the LGBT college group, and we had an office because we were a student group. But that was it. Like, even Nashville, I think, used to have one, but it closed. I went there, like, maybe once, but it was very underfunded and whatever. But they had, like, a library and everything in this one that I went to. And I ended up getting this, finding a copy of it online quite a bit later. But the Names Project, is the AIDS quilt, which I think I've already shown the picture without, like, explaining what it was. But each one of those squares represents a person who died of complications related to AIDS. And this was a project that they did, that they brought to DC. Each of those panels is 6x3, the same size as a grave, in order to show that people were dying, because Ronald Reagan wasn't doing shit. Did not acknowledge, I don't think he even said the word AIDS until, like, 1987, publicly. And so this meant a lot to me, especially, and another reason why I, like, got this, like, y'all know that I read a lot about the AIDS epidemic, I don't know why I'm pointing to it as though y'all know exactly what's on my bookshelf. That's my HIV and AIDS TBR. But this also, like, in my mind, in my, like, whatever, also relates to Trans Day of Remembrance, which is also something that's really big for me. In 2016, so the year before, we had our first on-campus Trans Day of Remembrance. And that summer, I was putting together the name list for it. I don't think that anyone knew how long it was going to be, or I probably wouldn't have been the only person doing it, because I found over 1,000 names over the course of that, like, summer and then some. But it was rough. This was also before I knew I was like non-binary and like was having like gender feelings. There's a lot to unpack, but we're not going to go into all that. But I was putting this together the summer of 2016, which is significant. That's when the Pulse shooting happened. So I was researching hate crimes when this massive hate crime happened, which, like, the research by itself was traumatizing. Like, reading about a bunch of dead people, murdered people, like, that's traumatizing. Obviously not as traumatizing as being there, but that's still a lot. And then seeing that afterwards. So it was a really tough time, and it also made it feel that much more necessary. Like, we, like, needed to really show how much of an issue this was. And so after going through all of that, and after having that be such a huge thing for me, then learning that people had done this before, that was just really impactful. Obviously not everyone needs a coffee table book about this, but I would definitely recommend looking at it if you get the chance to, getting it if you're invested in kind of like collecting books on gay history and stuff like that. And if nothing else, definitely learning about it, because this kind of project is just really incredible, and the topic that they're trying to talk about is also very, very important to know. That, I think, leads me more into kind of grad school era, which kind of started, that was like kind of the bridge to that, because I graduated from undergrad in 2015, so would have in the second half of 2015 started grad school, but I kind of took a semester where I only took one class and then really got into it in 2016. So that was the very beginning of that, and this next book is kind of more in the last half of that. There are a lot of things that I could look into so far as like sociology and whatever, but we're not doing a deep dive. This is just a couple of books to represent things. So, I have Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment by Patricia Hill Collins, which I have said so many times that everybody needs to read. So if you haven't, go do it. It is more expensive, unfortunately, although you can find used copies for less expensive. But this was one of the books that we read in my Race in the United States class, which was one of the last classes that I took. I don't remember if it was my last semester or the semester before my last semester taking classes. It took me longer to finish my thesis, but this looks at kind of how we get our knowledge, or what we see as legitimate knowledge, and kind of questions that. And then it actually looks at the history of Black women intellectuals and looks at what we would see if we took their knowledge and made that kind of a central point for understanding pieces of society. Now, the whole idea of epistemology and looking at marginalized knowledge and stuff like that is something that I was fairly familiar with. I was getting a certification in women's and gender studies. We were looking at things like feminist methodologies and epistemology and like all of this stuff. But this one in particular, especially in context with everything else that I read for this particular class, was really impactful, because it took like these ideas of, okay, so we're gonna like consider people's like knowledge and whatever, and did a deep dive into what we can see with this. So she talks about a lot of different things. I think one of the big things to come out of this that people talk about are controlling images and the limited ways that Black women have been represented, not just in terms of media, which is, I think, the first thing that we think of when we think representation, but also, like, politically, the picture that has been painted of them by white people. So through laws, through the things that politicians have said, through the ways that they've been treated widely. This is such an important book. It really contextualizes history in a lot of ways, and really, I think, shows why it's important to understand all of these different marginalized histories, because we can take this information and see kind of how history moves and progresses with us, and to really understand the vestiges of it that we still have and all of these problems that we still have to contend with. So this was really huge for me and represents, I think, a lot of what I learned and what I got out of my degree in certain ways. There's a lot of other pieces too, but like this is really great. Highly recommend it. I think everyone needs to read it. Then the next book that I have, I actually read after grad school. I read it in the second half of 2019, and I decided to go do a deeper dive into like the civil rights movement and stuff like that, especially after I had like a year or however long ago taken the Race in the U.S. class. But this is White Rage by Carol Anderson. And obviously I learned a lot of things from the books that we were looking at in the race class that really contextualized a lot of this. But this book went into some history that I didn't even learn from then. We had talked about kind of the backlash constantly that happens, like when we see kind of progression happening in terms of rights for people of color. You have the white, more conservative backlash happening immediately after. And we did talk about that some. But some of the particular events in the way that they're described in this book, we did not cover all of those. We covered a lot, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of books that I could talk about, but looking specifically at Andrew Johnson and the way that he just allowed people to be lynched all over the South directly after the Civil War, that was one thing that really stood out. And all of the fuckery that happened during the Reagan administration. Obviously, we talked about Ronald Reagan in my Race in the United States class. We listened to the infamous Lee Atwater clip. And we, like, talked about, like, the Southern strategy with Nixon and a lot of stuff that happened. But the thing that we didn't really talk about was, like, we talked about the war on drugs to a certain extent and talking about how people were over-incarcerated. But we didn't talk about the Reagan administration's role in the drugs being there in the first place. That was next level fucked up. Like, it's all fucked up, but, like, that's... damn. So those two things in particular were things that I hadn't learned before, and this was one book that actually had that, like, it, like, contextualized that backlash, in a way that was all right there. So I would also definitely recommend that. But that had a really big impact. It certainly wasn't like the first time that I'd seen some of the concepts, but the way that it like put it all together, and it was one of the things that really pushed me to want to do a further deep dive into the like fight for racial justice and what have you. That I'm still kind of, I'm still working through that book list, but, that's fine. From that book, we're going to shift gears a little bit because I have a poetry collection. That is Pansy by Andrea Gibson. I adore Andrea Gibson. This, I actually read when I was still in grad school, so we're going back in time a little bit, but Andrea Gibson was one of the performers at the Women's and Gender Studies conference that I was on the planning board of as a part of my graduate work. So this must have been about 2017, and I actually got to see them perform. But the first time that I ever listened to one of their poems was during the planning meeting when we were talking about who to bring. And we watched them perform the nutritionist, the Madness Face, aka the nutritionist. Completely blew my fucking mind. And then from there, I got to see Andrea Gibson perform live. I also had a really embarrassing moment actually talking to them, because I got to like help them out backstage, but I wasn't given clear enough instructions and was possibly the most awkward person on the face of the planet. So that's kind of mortifying. However, their actual performance was fucking incredible. And especially after, I talked about all the stuff with like TDOR and like whatever, their performance of Orlando, that shit had me fucked up. But like the experience of being there in a room of other people, strangers were like helping me and like giving me tissues and stuff like that. So like that whole experience was very impactful. And from there I read a lot of their poetry, which has impacted me on a lot of levels. So this is a very influential book. And then from there, I think the rest of the books are all things that I firmly read after I graduated. So first, we have The Road Back to You by Ian Morgan-Cron and Suzanne Stable. So this was actually the first book that I read on the Enneagram. And the Enneagram has helped me tremendously. I don't think this is the best book that I've read on. It is a very good book, though I will say that there's a lot of, like, religious kind of language. It's not as intensely Christian as some of the other books that exist out there. So like if it's like it's there but it's not in everything, and you can easily skip over the parts if that's not like your thing. The one that I typically recommend is The Wisdom of the Enneagram, which I think breaks down things even more, which I really love. I love, I was just talking about how I love the chapter on spectrums and different ways to like conceptualize stuff. So like seeing this really complicated system with all of this is like cool as hell to me, but might be a little bit confusing for some other people who aren't doing the most. Like I don't know. I know it's not everybody's thing. So this one actually probably breaks it down a little bit simpler than The Wisdom of the Enneagram. But I had a really great time reading this, and the Enneagram has helped me tremendously. I don't think that I've really talked that much about the trajectory of me, like, figuring my whole self out. I had periods of time where I really struggled with dissociation and depersonalization, especially around when I transitioned from high school to college. And there was a lot of stuff my senior year that was also, like, whatever, we're not going to get into it. So this was very helpful, just having a framework that I could actually see myself in and like ground myself in, and seeing how it all works together, because as much as you're like given, or you're not given one, you figure out which number you are, but it interacts with some of the other ones. This kind of fitting myself into a framework is probably also why I've gotten like ridiculously into astrology recently, but that's another thing. The Enneagram, though, very important to me, was very beneficial to me. It also helped that one of my therapists also used it, so we were able to talk about it some. So yeah, it's a good time. On that same kind of self-discovery, kind of whatever, I also have You and Your Gender Identity by Dara Huffman Fox. This I read in late 2019, so this would have been after I knew that I was non-binary, but there was still a lot that I had not parsed through because I have a lot of problems internalizing things. And also just like, this kind of stuff is a constant like journey. So this was a really wonderful read. It helped me unpack a lot. I've actually somewhere I have a whole little notebook that I filled out when I was reading this the first time. And this was incredibly helpful. Not only does it kind of bring you through steps to be able to kind of analyze yourself and understand things, it also brings in different tools to help you deal with that. So not just like how to unpack, but tools for what happens when you unpack things that are kind of hard. And understanding those tools has also been incredibly helpful. I highly recommend this book, absolutely. I wish that I had known about it when I was questioning, but this is still a really great book and was very impactful for me, kind of unpacking and understanding things. And this is definitely, like, as well as being, like, a good book in terms of, like, this list, I think that it represents a whole lot. Between this and the Enneagram book, I've had to do a lot of self-reflection because I have spent a lot of time ignoring myself, and holding a lot of stuff down. I could go into it, but I won't. If you're interested in some of it, you could look at my, like, video about figuring my sexuality and gender stuff out that I made forever ago. These next three kind of go along with that kind of self-discovery and also, like, representation and whatever. So the next book that I have is A Year Without a Name by Cyrus Grace Dunham, which I read around the same time that I read You and Your Gender Identity. This is a memoir that focuses on the author's experience being in a period of time without a name. It kind of goes back and forth to some of their past. And I don't have the book with me because I'm letting one of my coworkers borrow it. But their whole experience isn't, like, the same as mine, but there were pieces that, like, I've literally never felt like my experience has been so seen before. I actually read the piece of it that I'm talking about in another video, but the way that they describe that experience, I guess, of internalizing all of that and ignoring your truth to the point where it's almost like it doesn't exist. And you have to work to figure that out, but also the implications of figuring that out is so heavy. So, this was really great. It was also beautifully written. It's such, like, the way that they write is just beautiful, so I would recommend it on that basis as well. And then a little while later, I think either at the very end of 2019 or the very beginning of 2020, I read I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver, which is, like, I feel like the non-binary book that people talk about. But this really was very beneficial to me. This was the first book with a non-binary character by a non-binary author that I'd read that was fiction. Before this, I had read one other book with a non-binary character, The Symptoms of Being Human, which was good, but had some shortcomings, largely that came from the author being cishet, which he said that he's cishet, so I'm assuming that's correct. And you can tell by some of the details, whatever. That's not the point of this. It's still an okay book. It's a pretty decent book if you wanted to read it. But I Wish You All the Best is great. I felt a lot of things. I have not been in this character's situation, but the description of anxiety was very relatable. And this was the first time that I'd ever read about gender dysphoria, save for A Year Without a Name. This was the first time that I'd read gender dysphoria in a way that, like, made sense to me, that, like, I saw myself in. So that was really great. And it's also a great book. This final book that I have, I was hesitant to include, or, like, how much I should talk about it, because I know that the author, there were some things happening, and I don't know how if they got resolved or not, where the author was, like, misgendered the director, of, like, the movie that they're making for this. I don't know if it got resolved, how it got resolved, anything about it. So I just wanted to make a disclaimer before I talk about the book, so you can, like, figure that out for yourself. But regardless, I read this book towards the end of 2020, I think, and it really impacted me. I don't know how to articulate in words very well. Like I Wish You All the Best and A Year Without a Name, it spoke to a piece of me that I had never seen represented or discussed in the same sort of way. But the book is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets to the Universe. And so this is the experience of a boy in the 1980s who finds this friend and they fall in love. He also deals with a lot of other stuff too throughout the course of the story, dealing with his brother who's in jail and grief and all of this other stuff. But the reason, or one of the big reasons that the book impacted me the way that it did is because I hadn't really seen the experience of falling in love that I had had. And I think that I know now, especially talking or like looking more into like queer cinema and stuff like that, there probably is more. And I actually read, Any on My Mind after this, which had a piece of it. But this book still hit me. The way that, like, he didn't realize he was falling in love. And the way that it just happened so, like, softly and naturally. But he couldn't let himself realize it. Was just very relatable. I think that I talk extensively about this in other videos, including one of the ones that I've already mentioned, and probably in the vlog that I read this into. It just saw a piece of me that I was not prepared for. And on top of that, like, I don't know, there are pieces of Ari's character that spoke to me in different ways too, but I don't want to get into that. I've already filmed an hour and a half of footage. But suffice it to say, this fit a piece of representation feels so small because it's not just, oh, it's a gay character, but it hit on an integral piece of my experience. It's the same thing with A Year Without a Name, and to a slightly lesser extent, but still powerful. I wish you all the best. These books managed to capture something about myself that I didn't know that I desperately needed to see represented somewhere. Which again, I think we can go back to looking at Enneagram, like self-discovery sort of thing. Like, I don't know, there's a lot that could be unpacked about, like, the power of, like, being understood. That is probably more than 29 books for the 29 years that I've been around. It was really neat to be able to put this together, kind of put, like, pieces of my story together, framed by books. This is gonna be such a fucking long video. I don't know if I'm gonna refilm this or just have a video that's so long that only like 2 people are gonna watch all the way through it. Because, like, I mean, since when have I had short videos anyways? So, those are some books that were very significant to me. Definitely pay attention to what I said about some of them because there are a couple that I would not recommend, though most I would recommend. If you've read any of these, definitely let me know. And in the comments, tell me about a book that kind of represents something significant in your life. Thank y'all so much for watching. Bye.